Now. Good morning, everyone. This is Fostering L2 Motivation via learner collaboration with Derek Herbert and Nick Weston. And over to you, gentlemen.
Hi, I'm Nick Weston, the Young Learner Coordinator from the British Council in Japan. Derek, your mic's not on. Okay, I'm off to a good start. That's Derek Herbert. But don't worry, I think we've got other introductions on the video that I'm about to play. And basically, in this video, we'll be looking at some background for collaboration and why it's a good thing and how it helps develop and foster alto motivation. And then we're going to share two specific examples of collaborative learning that we did. So without further ado, we'll get started. Okay.
Hello everyone, and welcome to our presentation, Fostering L2 Motivation with Learner Collaboration. My colleague is Nick Weston. He's the British Council Young Learner Coordinator, and I'm Derek Herbert, a lecturer at Canada University of International Studies. Okay, so the goals for this presentation, we'll be looking at how L2 learning motivation can increase through the use of group work and project-based curricula. And also later on, my colleague Nick will be showing you examples of collaborative projects that demonstrate how the work can be used to motivate learners to develop their language skills. Okay, so this is a quick definition of collaborative learning. So any kind of group learning, but of course there have to be some meaningful learning interaction between the learners. Okay, and on to the research now. So in the last 20 years, rather than more competitive and individual learning activities, there's been strong emphasis on cognitive and motivational benefits of collaboration. And the teacher should become aware of encouraging learner cooperation in the classroom. It has been known to be a key factor in increasing learner motivation. Along with that, satisfaction and enthusiasm are other points of collaborative learning, which can also be increased through the achievement of goals as a group. Collaborative learning can also improve the cognitive activity of students. And also the learning environment does actually play a key role. So the teacher has to become aware of the correct learning environment for collaboration between learners. But also students must be motivated to use learning strategies. This regulates their cognition and efforts. The greater degree of student involvement, the greater the student learning and affect development, okay, as previous studies mentioned. So the learning environment is a critical factor when fostering for motivation. However, there are some drawbacks. So learners may be resistant to group activities. Learning styles are very important, along with preferences. So there are learners there with more introverted learning styles. So it's essential to provide learners with those lessons, materials, tasks that will engage all learners to foster motivation. But it is not an easy process achieving such coordination. So teachers must become aware of the learning environment, materials within collaborative projects. So there are also some external pressures. So group members may experience some challenges along the way. External pressures such as maybe family pressures or school pressures. But these challenges, they could place significant emotional pressure on individuals' kind of well-being and motivation. So the teachers must consider these factors as well. Cooperative learning, yes, it can improve students' motivation, but it may still not be enough. Maybe not 100% of learners could be fully focused, or they may be suffering from tiredness. So teachers should take this into account. And they should consider the materials that they work with also. Okay, so here are the references that were used in this research. So if you do want to do some further reading, by all means, please do so. Now I'm going to pass you over to my colleague, Nick, who's going to show you some examples of collaborative projects in the British Council. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for that, Derek. And now we're going to move on to look at some examples of collaborative learning activities. The first being a writing task for secondary plus or high school age students. The second is using Cubeto to encourage collaboration for primary plus, which is elementary age students. So first, I'd like to give you a bit of background to the courses. So Primary Plus and Secondary Plus are British Council designed courses based on task-based learning, communicative language teaching, and project-based work. So there's a lot of focus on collaborative work throughout the courses. In addition to 4 key skills development, there's also a great deal of emphasis on 21st century soft skills, including collaboration, global citizenship, and digital literacy, some of which I think can be quite difficult to actually provide focus on sometimes. But I think some of the activities that I'm going to share with you today are quite good examples of promoting these soft skills as well as the key language skills. Now, the courses are partially modular, so they are split into 5-week chunks, and each 5 weeks they have what is called a magazine, which is basically a short textbook. But each one has its own different theme or topic or outcome task. And over each 5-week period, the learners take part in a range of tasks and activities that lead to one final output task. And the following examples are activities that relied on learners having to collaborate successfully to complete the tasks. Now, the first is an example of communicative writing. It took place online during lockdown earlier this year. So I think that'll be quite relevant and important for a lot of people watching this. The second is an example of a task that specifically promoted collaboration and digital literacy and took place in regular pre-socially distanced class conditions. And before I move on, I'd like to say now that the examples that we have are more anecdotal in terms of providing evidence of the benefits of collaborative learning. And that's something I think we would both like to look at a bit more in future in terms of getting some concrete feedback from the students about the experience that they had as well. Now, some more background to the classes. As I mentioned, the Secondary Plus example was taught online, so using Zoom, also using Active Inspire and Padlet. The class consisted of 6 students who were aged between 15 and 18. And the overall level of the students is B1, but there's kind of a wide range in terms of that. So some were quite low B1 or very high A2, and some others were kind of high B1, low B2. So it's quite a range of ability between the students. As for the primary class, the example took place in November 2019, so it was last year, long before any lockdowns or coronavirus was impacting our teaching. And the class consisted of 7 students aged between 9 and 12. And the levels of the students varied between A2 and B2. Next, I want to go into more detail about the collaborative writing activity for the Secondary Plus students. And even though this is for high school students, I think there's a lot here that would be appropriate for adults as well as university students. Now, in terms of the lesson itself, the aim was to create a fact file about the Japanese language. So the topic of the magazine that they were studying at the time was about learning languages. And before the lesson, I asked the students to think of at least two interesting facts about the Japanese language that I wanted them to share. So they had a kind of pre-lesson task to do. In the lesson, the students sent their sentences to me via the chat function on Zoom. Then I put them onto a Word document and shared it for everybody to see. But the sentences actually remained anonymous. So apart from the person who wrote it, nobody else knew who'd written the sentences, which I think was quite important for making this particular activity a success. So the initial stage following this was for the students to peer correct the sentences. So they worked through each one, looking at spelling errors, grammatical errors as a group. And usually when I've done peer correction in class, it's quite difficult. Students are hesitant to point out each other's errors. They're kind of a bit shy or nervous when they know that an example of an error has been shared as well. And in this case, it was much more successful, and the students were much more forthcoming and were much more motivated, I think, from seeing their specific examples, but knowing that other students didn't know who had written what. So they were much more motivated to work together and collaborate and correct each other's work. And it's actually something that I've now taken into my regular face-to-face classes as a way of dealing with peer correction. So it's a much more interesting and I think motivating way for the students to correct each other's errors. And this had a big impact, I think, on motivating them to complete the exercise. Now, following this initial kind of peer correction, the next part of the writing process involved the students rewriting their sentences to include hooks. So here is an example from the lesson slide that introduces the concept of hook writing. And you can see where the students had to highlight the hook in this example sentence. And then they went on to edit each other's work. Now, to do this, I used Padlet. And we put the sentences up onto Padlet. And the students went through each one and offered ways to improve the sentences by adding hooks, so kind of adding that interesting piece of information. The reason I chose Padlet was it offered students the chance to edit each other's work in real time. I mean, in addition to other, I think, important factors for kind of child protection issues as well. So it gives you quite a lot of scope to edit the functionality of the Padlet page that you've created and shared with the students. So you can, for example, filter out foul language, or you can limit comments, or you can assign how students interact with the work. But what was good about this as a collaborative writing, which is actually really difficult to do in a regular face-to-face class, in this case, the students could see the changes that were being made and they could offer suggestions, which they became really invested in. Again, I think because they were less embarrassed or shy about the other students knowing who had written what. So as you can see here, this is what it ended up looking like. They'd made their fact file. You can see how they kind of generally had managed to correct each other's sentences. And you can see examples where they'd rewritten the sentences to include hooks as well. So I think overall, it really kind of opened up my thoughts and my mind in terms of how I could approach these kind of writing tasks. It was difficult in the first instance to think of how to do a writing activity online. But finding these tools really helped promote this idea of the students working together and doing this collaboratively. This one is using Cubeto. I'm sure a lot of people listening to this or watching this have not heard of Cubeto. And I'll give you kind of a brief overview of what this is in a moment. But this particular lesson involved learners working in teams to program a robot. And you can see here that little square smiley face is Cubeto the robot. The idea with this is that it introduces fundamental concepts that underpin computer programming. So for the example, you put in a code physically on this large keypad rather than kind of digitally in a conventional way. But it follows the same way that you would enter a code. And it teaches students how to debug and how to learn about process and different basic aspects about computer programming. You can see here there's a kind of square grid, and they can program the robot to move around on this square grid. They can use it to program the robot to move anywhere. To get started, I had the students work in groups to first write their own instructions on how to use Cubeto. So I split the students into one group of 3 and one group of 4. And basically, I didn't tell them how it worked. They experimented with it, and I left them for about 20 minutes to basically work out together how this thing works. And this kind of collaborative activity promoted quite a lot of communication between the students because they had to find out and explain to each other how it was working and what was going on with it. And then we all shared those ideas and made an instruction sheet that they could use to continue with the task. Then following this, it went on to the main kind of collaborative activity that I wanted them to do. I set each group the same challenge. They had to get to a certain point on the grid following different rules or restrictions. So this is the important part. So for example, you can see on this, you get different color blocks. So they do different things. So for example, red might be to move right. Green might be to go straight. Yellow might be to turn left. And I would say things, for example, like you need to get to this part of the grid, but you can only use the left turn function 2 times. So really got the students having to work together to kind of beat the restrictions that I'd set them. They had to work together successfully to complete the task, because it required a range of different skills that not each learner had or was strong in. So, for example, spatial awareness. So some of the students are much more capable of working out how their instructions would play out on the grid. Others were not, and it was interesting seeing them work together and balance that out. Also, kind of logic. So some students were less logical in their approach and would struggle initially to do it, and the students who were stronger in their logical approaches were able to help them. And again, with communication, so they had to communicate quite a lot to achieve the task. And what was really interesting about the communication, and this was unexpected, and I was actually having the lesson observed by another teacher as well, and they noted down quite a lot of complicated output language that the students were using, especially when they were unsuccessful. So they would start kind of going back and trying to find out what mistake they'd made. So when they were debugging the code, they're going back and saying, I can see what happened here, or this is the mistake that we made, or we need to change this, or I think it should go this way. So they kind of really opened up the language that they were using for this task. They were also very highly motivated to complete the task, and they were quickly aware that the most successful teams were those who worked together, so they could see each other as they were going along, and then they could realize, they're achieving the goal quicker because they're working together. So it's kind of interesting in terms of there was a slightly competitive aspect to it, but I encouraged them collaborating and working as a team with their own team. Um, Not only was there communicative collaboration, the physical nature of the device also meant they had to share the resources and be mindful of fair participation as well. So, because you had different parts and things that they had to work together, what would happen is they would assign each other roles. One would be in charge of the remote control, the others would be in charge of placing the device, the others would be in charge of trying to work out the route. So it's really interesting to see how the students really opened up and bought into the activity. Um, and as mentioned previously, thinking about the kind of materials that you use to encourage this collaboration, I think the novelty of the task itself helped encourage a lot of collaboration too. So I don't think I can discount the fact that these students were kind of very motivated because they were using a very interesting uh, device that they'd not used before. Um, so I mean, sometimes when you're thinking about these kind of activities, try and think outside the box. Think of other things that you can use and that you can exploit. And you know, even if you didn't have something like Cubedo, you could still set up a very similar activity. You know, just with some paper, essentially giving students limits and telling them how they can move something from one place to another. So you don't have to be limited by that. Now, for both of the examples that I've shared, there were some challenges. Encouraging participation was difficult. This is particularly for the teens and the secondary students. So being online is quite challenging enough to have natural communication, but also their age group, you know, being teenagers, they're not naturally communicative and outgoing. And very often the lessons did require a great degree of scaffolding language, not because of their linguistic ability. Like I said, they were all around B1 level, so they were very capable, but they weren't naturally outgoing. So you'd have to kind of run through acceptable language that they would need to complete a particular task. So it's something to bear in mind, and it's something I've had to be doing a lot for this particular age group. Even with students who are very linguistically competent, they still need some guidance and scaffolding in terms of being comfortable in using more communicative language. I mean, mentioned before, but also having access to these resources. So, you know, having access to good computers to do online learning, being able to use Padlet, depends what the devices that the students are using as well can impact what you're doing online. And as I mentioned, you know, having access to something like Cubeto might not be achievable for your particular situation. But I think again, you have to sometimes think outside the box. You can find other things that are similar. There are a lot of free to use apps and websites that do a lot of the features that we went over today with some of the examples. So you know, have a look around and see what you can find. I think that would have a big impact on how you can motivate students to work together collaboratively. And as I mentioned, having something that's a bit of a novelty from time to time can have a really big impact on this. Now, the next problem was more of an issue I actually found with the younger learners. So ensuring all of the learners contribute and take part. So you have to monitor carefully. You have to sometimes encourage quieter students to participate. I mean, one good thing I found to help deal with this is, in some cases, assigning particular roles to students for the tasks that you're setting them helps. And the example I shared today wasn't too much of a problem. They were all kind of contributing and allowing each other and helping each other, but they were a very positive group of students as well. So, you know, as much as I'd like to say this was all down to my teaching skills, they're actually a very nice group of students, and that makes a big impact. So if you're in a situation where you've got, for example, students arguing about who does what, or stronger personalities dominating, then one way to deal with this is to assign specific roles before they start, or to have good examples of the expectations and outcomes for the tasks in advance as well. So if you're being very clear to the students and telling them, not only do I want you to get this from A to B, or I want you to rewrite your sentences, but I will be also looking at how you're working together, how you're collaborating together. So you need to make that part of what the expectations are, so it's clear to the students that you are also looking at their collaborative skills in addition to their linguistic skills. And to summarize, and this is the case, I think, for both of the examples I've shared today. I think they both showed examples of meaningful interaction. So again, these things that are important for having successful collaborative tasks. They increase the motivation of the students. For the secondary case, I've never had such a positive outcome with doing a collaborative writing activity as I did when I tried this out. And I've used it several times with other classes since doing this. And it's had a really big impact. And for the primary students, they were very motivated on just achieving the task as it was, but they were also very motivated by the novelty of the situation. They were very student-centered, so after I'd kind of set up these tasks, and I was essentially just facilitating it and letting them get on with it. So I was very rarely having to interrupt or prompt students after they'd got started. There was a very positive outcome, I think, for the students as well. For the primary, it was more about the fun of achieving these goals and solving the puzzles and working over the restrictions I'd set them. For the secondary, they actually had a tangible, final, improved version of some of the writing that they'd shared, and they went through this process together. And I think they were able to finally see the value in doing collaborative and peer work, which sometimes in a face-to-face situation has been difficult for me to achieve. And finally, a big sense of achievement for them. So they were coming out of these lessons having done something that they'd never done before, able to do something that they maybe weren't able to do so well before. So I personally feel that using collaboration as a main factor in these lessons, or as a main focus of some of these tasks, really has a big positive impact on the students.
Okay, thank you very much, Nick. And to everybody who watched this presentation, I hope you did enjoy it. And if you do want a copy of the slides, then do contact us. But thank you very much for watching.
Yes, I would
Bye-bye.
like to say thank you very much also. And if anyone would like to thank the speakers, please unmute your mic and let's thank them. Thank you. And does anyone have a question? We've gone over time, but we have started late. So if anyone has anything they would like to add, please do. And if not, I will stop the recording. So thank you very much.